Her father gave her to an Apache warrior for punishment. But what he did, to her shock everyone. The decision was made without ceremony, spoken as if it were correction rather than surrender. And she stood beside her father listening as he explained to the gathered men that discipline required distance, that shame worked better when it was witnessed, and that the Apache warrior waiting outside would ensure she remembered her place. The girl did not cry when the words were said, though her hands trembled at her sides, because she had learned early that tears only hardened her father's resolve, and she would not give him that satisfaction now. The accusation was vague, something about defiance and disrespect. But everyone understood that punishment was not about the offense. It was about authority being challenged where it expected obedience. When the warrior stepped forward, the crowd leaned in, curiosity sharpening fear into something almost eager, because they believed they knew how this would end. He was tall and quiet, his expression unreadable, eyes steady as he listened to the father explain the terms as if passing along a chore rather than a child. The girl felt the shift when the warrior looked at her, not with threat or interest, but with assessment, the way one looked at weather before deciding whether to travel. And the absence of cruelty unsettled her more than shouting would have. Her father pressed the matter, insisting that she be taken immediately, that the lesson not be delayed, and the warrior nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement, a gesture that satisfied the crowd enough to let them imagine the rest. As they walked away from the settlement, the girl kept her gaze forward, refusing to look back, because looking back would make the choice feel reversible, and she needed to believe it was final to survive it. The land opened around them, quiet and vast, and with every step her fear sharpened, because silence allowed imagination to fill the space unchecked. She expected restraint, anger, something to justify what had been done to her. But the warrior kept his distance, walking beside rather than ahead, setting a pace that did not hurry her even when she stumbled. When they reached a stand of trees and stopped, she braced herself, breath shallow, body tight, waiting for the punishment to arrive, and the waiting itself felt like cruelty perfected. Instead, the warrior turned away from her and began clearing ground for a small fire, movements deliberate and calm, as if the task were ordinary. He said nothing until the flames caught, then told her to sit and warm her hands, his voice level, carrying no command beyond what safety required. The shock did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, because what unsettled her most was not the kindness itself, but the realization that the punishment meant to break her had already failed, simply because it had been given to someone who refused to carry it out the way everyone expected. She sat where he told her to, hands held near the small fire, unsure whether stillness meant safety or simply delay. And the uncertainty made every sound feel sharp. The Apache warrior worked quietly, feeding the flames only when needed, never rushing, never looming, and the restraint unsettled her more than anger would have, because it offered no clear shape to fear. She watched him carefully, noticing how he kept his knife sheathed, how he positioned himself so she could see him at all times, and how his back was often turned, as if refusing to make her the center of something cruel. When warmth finally reached her fingers and the shaking slowed, she felt the weight of how close the cold had come, and the realization frightened her because it meant survival had been narrow and undeserved. He spoke then, telling her night would arrive soon and shelter mattered more than questions, and the practicality of the words anchored her to the moment. She asked whether he had been ordered to hurt her, the question leaving her mouth before she could stop it, and the space between them filled with expectation. He answered without hesitation that he had been told to take her away, not to harm her, and that what happened after that belonged to him alone. and the distinction settled heavily because it returned choice to the man she had been taught to fear. They moved deeper among the trees, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could follow without panic. And he pointed out where wind cut hardest and where ground held warmth, speaking of the land as if it were a teacher rather than an enemy. When she stumbled, he steadied her briefly at the elbow and released her at once, the moment so careful it stayed with her longer than force ever could. At dusk, he built another fire and showed her how to sit without wasting strength, then handed her food without comment, treating hunger as fact rather than failure. She ate slowly, aware that everything she had expected from punishment was unraveling. And the unraveling left her unsteady because it offered no clear role to play. When she finally asked why he was doing this, why he was not finishing what had been started, he looked at her fully for the first time and said, "Punishment born of anger taught only obedience or bitterness, never understanding, and he would not carry harm simply because others demanded it." The answer struck harder than kindness, because it revealed intention rather than accident. And as night closed around the firelight, she understood that fear had followed her here, expecting cruelty, only to lose its script in the presence of someone who refused to perform it.
Morning arrived thin and gray, light filtering through the branches without warmth, and she woke stiff and uncertain, unsure whether the night had passed safely or simply paused. The fire still held embers, carefully banked, and the Apache warrior rose before she did, moving quietly so as not to startle her, adding wood with practiced hands that respected both flame and fuel. He handed her a cup of warmed water before she asked, watching to make sure she drank slowly, and the attention felt different from control because it did not demand gratitude. As she stretched her fingers toward the heat, she realized how much effort the night had required from him, how vigilance could be given without spectacle, and the realization unsettled her because it reframed what strength looked like. He told her they would move once the sun climbed higher, choosing a route that followed shelter rather than speed, and explained that travel was not about distance, but about arriving intact, a lesson that applied to more than the woods. As they walked, she noticed how he kept her in sight without crowding her path, adjusting his pace to hers without comment, and the respect embedded in the gesture made her chest tighten in a way fear never had. She asked whether he would take her back, whether the punishment would resume once daylight made witnesses easier to find, and he answered that daylight did not change right from wrong, only visibility, and he would not trade one for the other. The answer lodged itself in her thoughts, heavy and steady, because it suggested that restraint was not weakness, but discipline practiced in full view. They stopped near a stream where ice thinned at the edges, and he showed her how to cross safely, testing footing first and offering his hand only when needed, releasing it as soon as she steadied herself, and the choice to let go mattered as much as the help. When they rested, she asked what would happen next, and he said they would reach his people by evening, that she would be seen and fed, and that no harm would come to her there, not because she was owed mercy, but because harm would not be allowed. The certainty in his voice was quiet, and the quiet carried authority she had never known. As the day wore on, her fear did not vanish, but it changed shape, becoming cautious curiosity, and she realized that silence was no longer something forced upon her, but something she could choose, a space where she could listen and decide. By the time the trees thinned and the land opened ahead, she understood that what shocked everyone would not be an act performed in anger or spectacle, but the steady refusal to complete a punishment that had been handed over expecting cruelty, and the understanding steadied her steps as they moved forward together. The path defined not by what had been demanded, but by what had been deliberately withheld.
They reached the edge of the camp as the sun lowered, smoke rising in thin lines that spoke of evening meals rather than alarms. And she felt her steps slow, uncertainty tightening again, because this was the moment she had been warned about all her life. The Apache warrior paused before entering, not to instruct her how to behave, but to tell her plainly that she would be introduced, not delivered. And the distinction mattered because it separated presence from punishment. As they walked in together, heads turned, not sharply, not with hunger for spectacle, but with assessment. And the lack of immediate reaction unsettled her more than hostility would have. A woman approached first, older, eyes steady, asking the warrior who the girl was, and he answered simply that she was someone placed in his care for the night, and that no harm was to come to her. The statement carried weight without explanation, and the woman nodded once, accepting it without challenge because authority here did not need to be loud to be understood. The girl noticed how space was made for her without being forced, how children were guided away gently instead of being pulled back in fear, and the normalcy of it chipped away at the story she had been prepared to live. Food was brought without ceremony, a bowl placed near her with no instruction beyond a gesture inviting her to eat. And hunger overcame hesitation quickly, grounding her in the present. The warrior sat a short distance away, visible but not looming, answering questions from others in low tones that never circled back to accusation or demand. When someone asked why she was there, he said only that not all punishments deserve to be completed. And the answer passed through the group without argument, settling like a rule already known. As night came on, a place was prepared for her near the fire, not isolated and not surrounded. And the balance felt intentional, offering safety without confinement. The girl watched the flames and realized that fear had carried her this far, expecting cruelty. And what it found instead was order without humiliation, discipline without harm, and a community that did not need her pain to confirm its strength. When she finally lay down, the sounds around her were ordinary. Voices, movement, life continuing. And the ordinariness shocked her more deeply than any threat could have. Because it meant the punishment meant to break her had lost its audience. And without an audience, it could not survive. Morning in the camp arrived with quiet purpose. People moving into their work without gathering to witness anything. And the absence of attention told her more than ceremony ever could. She woke where she had been allowed to rest, not guarded and not hidden. And for a moment, she waited for someone to tell her what came next, because punishment usually announced itself early. Instead, an older woman handed her water and nodded toward the fire, treating her presence as fact rather than exception. And the simplicity of the gesture loosened something in her chest. The Apache warrior spoke to the elders soon after, his voice calm and low, explaining that the girl had been given to him as correction, not justice, and that he would not turn anger into instruction simply because it was expected. The elders listened without interruption, faces unreadable. And when he finished, one of them said that discipline was meant to guide, not to wound, and that anyone who needed cruelty to prove authority had already lost it. The words settled the matter without argument. And the girl realized that what shocked everyone was not mercy, but the refusal to perform pain for approval. As the day unfolded, she was shown where to help if she wished, not ordered, not tested. And she chose small tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind steady, surprised by how quickly usefulness could replace fear. Children passed by without staring, curiosity kept gentle by adults who redirected them easily, and the normal rhythm made it harder for dread to find a place to rest. When someone from the settlement arrived later, sent by her father to ask whether the punishment had been carried out, the Apache warrior met him at the edge of the camp, speaking plainly and without heat. He said the girl was safe, that no harm had been done, and that the matter ended there because punishment delivered without purpose did not deserve completion. The messenger protested weakly, invoking authority and expectation. But the warrior answered that expectation did not outrank responsibility, and the elders stood with him in silence that needed no explanation. The messenger left without satisfaction, and the girl watched from a distance, understanding that what had been denied was not vengeance, but spectacle. As evening returned, she sat near the fire again, hands warm, heart unsteady but intact. And the warrior told her she would be returned only if she chose it, that her safety did not depend on anyone's anger or pride. The choice stunned her more than any threat could have, because it placed the future back into her hands. And as the fire burned steadily, she understood that the punishment meant to define her had failed, not through resistance, but through refusal. Because someone had decided that harm did not need to be completed simply because it had been ordered. Word traveled the way it always did on the frontier, unevenly, shaped by who told it and who wanted to hear it. And by the second day, the settlement had already begun to change its story. What had been framed as punishment returned to them as restraint, and restraint unsettled people who depended on fear to feel justified. The girl sensed it in the way messengers arrived and left without ceremony, in the careful distance kept by those who came to look without admitting they were curious. The Apache warrior continued his routines, neither hiding her nor presenting her, allowing life to proceed as if no performance were required, and the absence of spectacle denied rumor the fuel it needed. Elders spoke quietly among themselves, not about the girl, but about precedent, about how authority weakened when it demanded cruelty for proof, and the conversations carried outward, reaching ears that had expected a different ending. When another man arrived from the settlement, braver than the first, he asked directly what had been done to her, and the warrior answered that nothing had been done except what was necessary to keep her safe. The simplicity of the answer frustrated him, because it offered nothing to argue against, and he left with less certainty than he had arrived. The girl noticed how the camp adjusted around her without centering her, how protection did not require confinement, and the steadiness allowed her to breathe without measuring every sound. She asked the warrior whether people would accept this, whether refusal would bring trouble, and he answered that trouble arrived whether invited or not, but how it was met decided who carried it afterward. The truth of it lingered, because it acknowledged risk without surrendering to it. As afternoon settled, she helped where she could, hands learning tasks that grounded her in the present, and the work replaced waiting with movement, fear with purpose. When the warrior spoke again, it was to tell her that the shock people felt would not come from what he had done, but from what he had not allowed to happen. And that denial often echoed louder than action. The girl understood then that the punishment had failed not because it was resisted, but because it had been deprived of meaning. And meaning was the only thing it had relied on. As evening approached, she felt the weight of eyes beyond the camp, watching from a distance, unsure how to respond to an ending that refused to satisfy expectation. The fire burned low and steady. The camp held its shape, and the shock continued to travel outward, not as outrage, but as confusion, because cruelty unperformed left nothing for people to point to. And without something to point at, they were forced to look at themselves instead. By the third morning, the girl realized that fear had stopped waking before she did, replaced by a quieter awareness that followed her through the camp without pressing in on her chest. People greeted her with nods rather than questions, offering direction only when she asked. And the absence of scrutiny allowed her to move without rehearsing herself first. The Apache warrior checked on her once at the start of the day, not to remind her of rules, but to ask whether she wished to remain or walk to the river with the others. And the choice, offered without consequence, steadied her more than certainty ever had. She chose the river, following a small group that spoke little and worked with rhythm instead of instruction. And the normality of the task, washing tools, carrying water, listening to birds rise from the reeds, pulled her out of the narrow space punishment had tried to trap her in. When a child stumbled near her, she reached out instinctively to help, and the easy acceptance of the gesture surprised her, because it assumed her presence as useful rather than suspect. The warrior watched from a distance, not supervising but aware, and the distance itself communicated trust that had not been earned through obedience, but granted through restraint. Later, when an elder asked her where she would go when this ended, the girl paused, realizing she had stopped counting the days toward departure, and answered honestly that she did not know yet. The elder nodded, satisfied, saying that not knowing was often the beginning of choosing well. News arrived that her father had spoken again, angered by the refusal to complete the punishment. And the girl felt the old tension return for a moment, expecting consequences to follow. The Apache warrior met the news without change in posture, explaining that anger traveled faster than reason, but it did not have the right of passage. And the explanation settled her because it acknowledged danger without surrendering to it. As the day unfolded, the camp continued its routines, unbent by pressure from outside, and the steadiness taught her something she had not known how to name. The protection could be collective without being suffocating. When evening came, she sat by the fire with others, listening rather than shrinking. And the sound of shared voices filled the space punishment had once claimed. The warrior spoke quietly to the group about journeys and weather, not about her, and the omission mattered because it allowed her to exist without explanation. As the firelight softened faces around her, the girl understood that what had shocked everyone was not mercy performed for approval, but a refusal shared by many to let harm define what came next. And in that refusal, she was no longer alone in carrying the weight of what had been intended for her. When the question of return finally surfaced, it did so without urgency, carried on a morning wind that felt lighter than the days before. And the girl understood that choosing did not mean rushing. The Apache warrior told her plainly that she could remain until she decided otherwise, that safety did not expire because patience grew thin, and the clarity allowed her to consider the path ahead without fear steering the answer. News came that her father had demanded she be sent back, framing it as order restored, and the message landed with less force than she expected, because the camp had already taught her the difference between authority and care. The elders gathered, listening to the demand without anger, and answered that the girl would return only if she wished it, not as punishment completed, but as a person choosing her own ground. The decision carried weight beyond the camp, because it denied spectacle again, and denial, repeated, became precedent. The girl asked to walk with the warrior beyond the trees, wanting space to think where the land opened and noise fell away, and he agreed without instruction, matching her pace as they moved. She spoke of fear that still lingered, of anger she did not know where to place, and of the pull of home even when home had failed her. And the warrior listened without correcting, understanding that naming a wound did not heal it, but made it visible enough to tend. When she said she would return, not to submit but to set a boundary, the warrior nodded, accepting the choice as complete, and said he would walk her to the edge, no farther, because escort was not possession. At the edge of the settlement, people gathered quietly, watching without cheering, unsure how to read an ending that offered no drama. And the girl stepped forward alone, shoulders square, breath steady. She did not apologize, and she did not accuse. She stated where she would live, what would not be allowed, and who would be told if those lines were crossed. And the firmness in her voice surprised even her. The shock did not come from her words alone, but from the knowledge that they were backed by a refusal that had already held once. As she turned back toward the road, the Apache warrior remained where he was, visible but separate, and the distance honored the choice without weakening it. The crowd felt the absence of punishment like a missing noise, and in that quiet, everyone understood that what had changed could not be undone by command, because a boundary once held in daylight had taught them how little cruelty accomplished when it lost its stage. The settlement did not react the way it had expected to, and that was where the true shock began to settle. Not in raised voices or confrontation, but in the uneasy quiet that followed her return. People watched her move through familiar spaces with a new steadiness, unsure how to place her now that punishment had failed to reduce her, and the uncertainty followed them into their work like a question they could not finish asking. Her father avoided her at first, waiting for authority or anger to do what he no longer could. And when neither arrived, the absence weighed heavier than confrontation ever would have. She kept her distance without hiding, choosing paths that were visible and deliberate, understanding that being seen on her own terms mattered more than retreat. Word spread quickly, not embellished, but precise, that the Apache warrior had not harmed her, that he had refused to perform cruelty, and that the refusal had been upheld by many rather than one. And the precision of the truth left little room for argument. Men who had once spoken confidently about discipline now softened their tone, unsure whether certainty still served them, and women who had stayed silent before began correcting stories as they formed, not loudly, but firmly enough to stop them from growing. The girl felt the shift most clearly in small moments. Doors held open without comment, conversations pausing to let her pass, eyes meeting hers and not sliding away. And the ordinary respect unsettled her because it required no explanation. Her father confronted her once, voice low and tight, accusing her of making him look weak. And she answered calmly that weakness had revealed itself without her help. And the clarity of the response ended the exchange because it offered nothing to push against. The Apache warrior remained at a distance now, his presence known but not imposed. And the restraint protected both of them from being turned into symbols rather than people. Elders from the settlement spoke quietly with one another about what had happened, not debating whether punishment should have been carried out, but whether it should have been demanded at all. And the shift in the question marked a change deeper than outcome. The girl noticed that children watched her differently, not with fear or awe, but curiosity, and she returned the looks without flinching, understanding that example did not need instruction to teach. As days passed, the story lost its sharp edges, became something heavier, harder to dismiss because it did not end with domination or apology, but with boundaries held. The shock, she realized, was not what the Apache warrior had done for her, but what he had refused to do for others. And the refusal had left the settlement facing itself without distraction. In that silence, change took root slowly, unevenly, and without permission. Because once cruelty was denied its ending, everyone was forced to decide what they would allow to stand in its place. Time did not rush in to smooth what had happened. And the girl learned that this too was part of the shock. Because endings that mattered rarely closed themselves neatly. She moved forward with caution that no longer felt like fear, choosing when to speak and when to remain quiet, aware that her steadiness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Her father kept his distance, pride wounded in a way that could not be mended by command. And the space between them spoke clearly enough that words were no longer required. The Apache warrior did not return to the settlement, and his absence mattered as much as his refusal had, because it prevented the story from becoming spectacle again, leaving it instead as a fact that could not be argued away. Life resumed in pieces. Work completed, meals shared, seasons shifting. But the memory of what had not happened lingered beneath routine, changing how quickly people reached for punishment when order felt threatened. The girl noticed it when a dispute broke out nearby and was settled with restraint rather than display. When someone asked for explanation instead of obedience, and the quiet changes carried more weight than any declaration could have. She understood then that the punishment meant to define her had failed not only because it was refused, but because its failure had been witnessed and remembered, turning cruelty into something exposed rather than inevitable. The shock everyone spoke of did not belong to a single act of kindness or bravery. It lived in the absence of harm where harm had been expected, and absence proved harder to erase than action. As she walked through the settlement with purpose, neither hiding nor performing strength, she felt the future open in small, practical ways, shaped by choices she could now make without fear dictating them. The lesson traveled quietly beyond her, settling into conversations and hesitations, teaching without instruction that authority did not require pain to survive. What remained after punishment failed was not forgiveness neatly offered or justice loudly claimed, but a boundary drawn and held. And the understanding that once cruelty lost its ending, it also lost its power. If this story made you pause, like the video, share it with someone who believes restraint can be stronger than cruelty, and subscribe for more Western American tales.